All right, let's get into it. Since I'm not monetized, and nor do I really want to be, YouTube only gives me so much time to make videos. I've tried to make videos an hour long plus before, and of course they refuse to let them download, and I believe it has to do with the fact that I'm not monetized. So this is the final in the series called Madame Cary and Madame Butterfly. Sorry about that. And Olivia Blanchard Cary. So hey everyone. In the first series, I briefly discussed Madame Butterfly, so you can go back a few days ago and watch that. In the second series, I've already broken down who Jessie Redmond Fawcett actually was. So you can go back earlier in this month and watch that on the first video of Madame Butterfly and Olivia Blanchard Cary. And the breakdown of how literature and perpetuates selective like racism or stereotypes of certain groups. If you're keeping up with the series, you may have watched the videos already. In this final installment, I will cover the fictional character Olivia Blanchard Cary and how she fully played into Blumenbach's racial categories. You see very little of it. It deals more so with passing because that's her novels, but you still gonna see some elements of Blumenbach here. In the novel, Comedy American Style was Fawcett's fourth and final novel, of course. I didn't say that right. In all of her novels, she touched on colorism and how it impacted black women. So there's going to be some page turning and things like that because I also have the book. There are very few variations of this book, okay? But the one you see right now is the one I'm going to be reading from because the page numbers change based on the variation. So this is the variation you see. That's on the screen is the one I will be reading from, okay? The novel is written to compare the Harlem Renaissance in a small way, the way it's written, with commedia dell'arte, the form of comedy that emerged in the Italian Renaissance. I won't focus on that for this book review, but it's important to know that the tempo of the novel is written in the form of commedia dell'arte. It is divided into 6 acts as if it is a play, as is custom during the Harlem Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, And I will mostly stick to the first 4 acts. I'll briefly go through the 5th, more like what she calls plots. I'll go through the 5th plot and the 6th plot really fast because by then what happened to Oliver we'll talk about later in this live happened to Oliver. So we'll be a little bit past the Blumenbachish portion of it, but not quite. All right, let's go to the second slide. I've already given a brief synopsis of Jessie Redmond Fawcett, so please feel free to research her novels, research her. I won't go back through that. Again, after this, you all can go back and pause and read the slides later because the slides got some pretty decent information. There are many publications about passing in old magazines. If y'all want to know about that, go to the Library of Congress and you can research Jessie Redmond Fawcett's name and you can see things about people passing as another race and things. It's in old, not magazines, newspapers. Slipping up majorly today, y'all. Additionally, please feel free to pause and go back and read this as well. I'm not going to go into the racial categories because as I have stated previously, we've talked about this all month long. This is just a brief synopsis to let you know that these are the categories. If you want to go freeze frame read this, feel free to do so, or feel free to watch the video I made on November 1st. Okay? Because we're rolling fully into this now. Okay, slide 5 is just a reminder in general because I won't go through that either. that all kids at some point in the United States, mostly in elementary school, will find out that they belong to a racial stratification. And this is just indicative of that. So you can go back, also pause and read this slide. Now we're going into slide number 6. The plot, which is part 1 of the 6 parts. The book alludes to the fact that Olivia was oblivious to the fact that she was the only black child playing with children of other races or other ethnic backgrounds. So this is the beginning of Olivia as a little girl, until she gets into like age, I think, of 17. So she's playing on a January morning, I believe. They're throwing snowballs in her neighborhood. One child, white, who had previously ignored Olivia Blanchard, the little black girl, yells at her something about, "Don't play with me ever again, you nasty little N-word." Her parents, Lee and Janet Blanchard, make some observations about Olivia, but don't intervene or pry. So they know that after that day something was wrong, but they don't ask questions. Her father is sick and presumably dying, which happens before chapter 2, of course. After his death, Olivia asks her mother if they cannot tell people they are colored, because Janet Blanchard, in comparison to Lee, could actually pass for white like Olivia. That one day after that, the little white girl calls her a nasty little N-word, it sets the tone for the rest of this novel. A couple of years later, she's a teenager, 17, and starts to act out on her fantasy to act white. It finally dawns on Janet Blanchard that Olivia hates living as a black person. While Janet declares that she won't change her race, she allows Olivia to make her own decisions. So they're about to move to Boston. I think this happened originally in Harlem and then they moved to Boston, but you all can correct me later. In Boston, Janet and Olivia start a boarding house. Janet meets a man named Ralph, I think, Blake. He's also light-skinned. They marry. Then Janet, who is up in years, gives birth to twins David and Janet, who are as lighter skinned as Olivia. Olivia doesn't take any interest in Ralph, and she's indifferent and cold to him, but is suddenly drawn to her newborn baby sister and brother, who can pass for white. This is when you really see how messed up she is. They own a boarding house, and this is, of course, how she met Ralph Blake. 3 young male students stayed in the boarding house. The first 2 were lawyers that Olivia had no interest in entertaining. Of course, because they took in college students, because he worked on a campus, Ralph Blake. The third, Christopher Cary, who the novel states is whiter in skin than Olivia, had no interest in passing as white. However, he didn't go around speaking of black pride either. Olivia is immediately cold towards him. Chris takes an interest in her but makes a statement suggesting that he understands who Olivia Blanchard is. And this is what he says to her: "You can always tell a good woman because she is so cold." And it's hard to know if he was taking a jab or if he was being serious. Her deciding factor, it seems, in marrying him after her initial rejection was her twin siblings. With a husband who has striking Caucasian features, she could still live white. Because I think somewhere in the novel she was originally looking for a husband to live white, who was actually white, if that makes sense. Now this one is the characters, okay? In the second plot, okay, Olivia is now Olivia Blanchard Cary and married to Dr. Christopher Cary because he's finished his degree in things. Their only daughter, Teresa, is their firstborn. Christopher Jr. is their secondborn. Both were born lighter skinned, so Olivia makes it her mission to control their lives, and you're going to see this later in the novel. Their third-born child resembles her late father, Lee Blanchard. And once the baby's brought to her, she yells, "This is not my baby," because she was in denial that she gave birth to such a dark-skinned child. She is displeased and dismisses the child. At this point, the Carys are living in Philadelphia, where Christopher Cary works as a doctor. In the opening chapter, Olivia stares out the window at Teresa on her way home from school. Teresa walked home with two black girls. The first is Phoebe Grant. Phoebe has noticeable Nordic features and could pass for white. The second child, Maurice Davies, who is dark, could not so easily pass and was visibly dark. When Olivia makes up a lie that Teresa can only have one of the girls come in the house, she chooses Phoebe. Phoebe instead sides with Maurice because she likes Maurice Davies more than Teresa Cary and they decide to go to Phoebe's home. Phoebe does not have the shame of being black in the way that Olivia would think that she should have. At this point, Chris is already aware that his wife is a colorist, and this is when in the novel, if you ever go read it, you'll see that Christopher Cary is now losing his patience with Olivia's nonsense. He now knows that she truly hates being black. At first he plays along, but then the resentment starts to set in. And by the time you get to this part of the novel, his resentment is there. It's a passive resentment at best, but it's there. Teresa often would go over and visit Maurice Davies' house and notice a warmth and kindness from her own mother and hospitality missing out of her own home. Maurice's mother can even sense that Teresa is tense and makes statements, "Honey, so long as you're happy, that's all that matters." I'm paraphrasing. Then the children transition to teens and early adults. Olivia prepares Chris Jr. to go off to an all-white prep school to meet the right connections, as well as Teresa. They're not quite adults yet, but she's preparing them for adulthood where she would like them to go live as white. Her husband doesn't like the plan but pensively agrees to it. Chris Sr. reasoned that Chris Jr. and Teresa, because she also slated to go away, will meet better people. Based on how the story reads, I suspect Olivia was preparing her children to pass as white. Again, I just told y'all that. It is at this point that Oliver has already been sent away and is bounced back and forth between both sets of his grandparents. But because she needed to bring Oliver back now that they were leaving, for some reason the novel didn't fully say why the child that was bronze-skinned that she initially didn't want, she suddenly wanted him to come home now that they're out of the house. Her husband didn't know what her plan was, and neither did her son, but they had their suspicions. Okay. So these two go off to boarding school. In the next plot, the third one, I believe, I think that's the one we're on. In this act, Teresa is in high school. You'll see her transition from high school to college graduation to her marriage to a poor Frenchman. Okay. Chris Sr. has agreed to plan to send his two elder children away to preparatory school. Teresa passively agrees, while Chris Jr. is angry because Chris Jr., of course, has no issue with living black despite the fact that he looks white. And he's already began to disdain his mother's ambitions to live white. There's more to this plot that you'll need to read later on when you read the book. The significance of it is that she uses the youngest son to go full Blumenbach. You won't see that as much as in the fourth act, but we'll get into that. Well, what Jesse Redmond Fawcett calls plots. During her prep school and college days, Teresa sends letters back and forth to her brother Chris Jr., with whom she vents her frustrations about having to pretend to live white. Also, you'll see like David and Janet, the twins who are only 2 years older than their niece Teresa, poke fun at Olivia's obsession with wanting to live white. Although they're lighter skinned, they don't share her view. So how does Blumenbach manifest in this plot? There is a point in the book when Teresa returns home from school on a family visit. Teresa and Oliver discuss how Oliver is being treated by Olivia, because in comparison to her mother, Teresa's very nurturing to Oliver, as is Chris Jr. and his father, Chris Sr. This is when Oliver shares that him and his mother play a game. Okay? So some committee women, all white, come to the house often. And Oliver has decided to play along of his will in order to get his mother's affection by passing himself off racially ambiguous as either Mexican or Japanese. Now remember, the Japanese are considered yellow or Mongolian people in the Blumenbach racial categories, whereas the categories itself doesn't fully define Mexican people. However, okay, lighter skinned Mexicans still fairly got into Hollywood back in the day. So it was probably pleasing for some reason, which someone else can explain why, despite the fact that what we know as Mexicans now don't fit into the Blumenbach racial categories unless you fit them into the American category, was preferred. Teresa is appalled by how her mother is acting, but not enough to intervene. Chris Jr., on the other hand, came in from boarding school and initially saw it and was immediately ticked off. During this time between her college and everything, she falls in love with a guy named Henry. A lot of things will happen in this book that are extremely racial. Olivia takes it to a level that it doesn't need to go. But the point is, when it comes to full Blumenbach, she's going to start to escalate. So she falls in love with a black man in her college years named Henry, who comes from a well-to-do upper-class black family, presumably according to the novel. While they are together, she's happy to be with him. Eventually, Olivia finds out he's black and insists that in order for her to accept the relationship, he could pass for Mexican. Henry, with no hatred for being black, is furious. Even more furious when Teresa agrees with her mother that it would be better off for him to. Instead, he feels that they are basically sick people. He doesn't say that, but I'm paraphrasing. Walks out of her life after initially going to give a formal proposal, walks out of her life, and she never sees Henry again. This is Teresa because of Olivia's demands. This is the time when Teresa has finally openly consented to her mother's nonsense, but secretly hoped to be with Henry. So to cheer Teresa up, Dr. Cary has decided to give them both money, Teresa and Olivia, to travel to France, where she meets a poor, I won't say he's a poor white Frenchman who acted as their tour guide, but because he was white, the assumption was, okay, that this man was going to treat her better because he's white. Olivia Blanchard Cary did not care that the man her daughter was marrying was of lesser influence because of his whiter skin. But because he was white and he was in France, she saw it as an opportunity for her daughter to live in that world. Let's go to the fourth plot. Finally, I say plot instead of act, This is where it's gonna get offensive. So if you have, okay, my chair wobbling, my bad, y'all. If you don't have a thick skin, this one might bother you. This is Oliver's act. In the opening of the plot, it explains how Oliver grew up living with both sets of grandparents before returning home in his teens. Again, you can see on the screen who the grandparents were. Most of this act, it will not occur to Oliver that his mother didn't like him based on the color of his skin. He instead was intrigued by her coldness and wanted to go home to understand why she was cold towards him. Okay, so we're going to break down a few instances in which you can see a little bit of the Blumenbach here in Oliver's act, because with him, she goes full Blumenbach. In the first instance, we see her indifference is when Oliver wants to share his good grades at school. I won't necessarily say this is Blumenbach. Olivia proceeds to scold him for lack of manners because he, quote, non-quote, interrupted her, then passively listens as if his achievements are insignificant. An ode to the fact that because he's black, his achievements mean nothing to her. In the second instance, he sees his mother in public with her white friends. He calls out for her, but she ignores him. Later in private, she scolds him by stating he acted like a wild Indian. Remember, if you look at the Blumenbach racial categories, in the original categorization, what they call offensively the red man was at the bottom, known as the American. So she's alluding to the fact that what we now call the indigenous peoples of America or Native America or American Indians lack decorum, and that her son acted as if they would act because they lack decorum. The third instance, I'm going to now pick up this book, read something. Okay. Let me see if I can find it. It was page 207. So, this is an excerpt of when Olivia wanted more money for the house that Christopher couldn't give because his wife wanted to keep up with her wealthy white friends. Okay. Remember that although Oliver is acting as her quote non-quote Mexican or Japanese butler, remember the Japanese are considered yellow people according to Blumenbach. Chris Sr. has no clue that his son is acting as his wife's butler when he's at his busy at his office and not around. So this is what she has to say to her husband when she argues for a butler before Oliver decides to do it for her in secret to please her. She told her husband of her decision. But I should think you would see, Christopher, Chris Sr., the husband, that it would be cheaper to have a butler of our own. Those Filipino butlers come very cheap. What would 3 people of our taste be doing with a Filipino butler? You talk like a fool, Olivia. About this conversation, there was none of the gay badinage which some couples discuss their expenses. Then you'd be given more parties to show off your butler. She said attentively, there's Oliver's money. This is offensive for several reasons. Number one, she implied that her son's money should be used. Her youngest son, because she had no regard for him because he's bronze skinned like his late grandfather Lee Blanchard. That the money that was set aside for him by, of course, his parents who gave him money, Aaron and Rebecca Cary, should be used to fund the butler. Which means she had no regard for Oliver's future because she sees him as a burden. Must remember, Filipinos, in comparison to their Japanese counterparts at the time, were seen as brown people. And there was some selective racism going on with Filipinos, which I covered early in the month with Robert Louis Stevenson. So she must have picked up on the fact that being Filipino, okay, involved servitude. And he really was just the color of that Filipino butler at Miss Birkback's house, and his white shirt sleeves, he was immaculate. Meaning that Oliver, looking racially ambiguous, could pass for a Filipino in her mind, and it worked out. Of course, again, remember, Chris Sr. doesn't know that when he's out of the house, his son is wearing a butler uniform and serving white ladies tea and pretending that his mom's white. They don't talk about the race. That is what's annoying. Okay? That's that instance. Now, we're going to get to the one that is really annoying here in a minute. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so I found that this next reading was page 205 to 206, so I got a little bit ahead of myself with 207 to 208 discussing the Filipino butler. But the point about it is that even her, as a light-skinned black woman that could pass, she associated Filipinos with servitude. Again, the racial categories, Filipinos are brown people according to the racial categories. Here's what she has to. Here's what the Arthur Jesse Redmond Fawcett, when he created this character, let you know what Olivia thought of other races of people. Beginning with looking at her own son. To her, Oliver meant Shane, her own son. He meant more than that. He meant the expression of her failure to be truly white. There was some taint in her, she told herself once, not long after Oliver's birth, for she belonged to that group of Americans which think that God or nature created only one perfect race, the Caucasians. The idea that there were more unwhite than white people in the world had for her no significance. Chinese, Negro, Indian, Malay, all of them, as far as she was concerned, were imperfections, base metals, misfits, garbage. Any union with them meant that the introduction into the social order of something corrupt, repulsive. Still, she had to live with her husband. She was no fool. She did not care for whiteness to the ultimate degree of facing starvation. But she had thought that in the early days of her obsession, that if a child of hers could just marry a white person, that everything else would fall into line. She would, of course, live with this new combination. There would be no question of their standing in that powerful and fortunate white world. It would be so easy with the money, which, as a matter of course, she expected her husband to furnish, to push forward to newer heights of affluence and privilege. For her, meaning white privilege. Remember, when she makes this created only one perfect race, Caucasians, they're at the top of the Blumenbach. That's all white people. The unwhite people she listed, Chinese, remember, a conquered people because Japan was the only non-white imperial power. I explained this in the beginning. Were considered on this scale yellow people. Negro, considered Ethiopian or black. Indian, what's called the red man or anybody in the Americas. Malay, brown people, the Malayan people on the racial categories. This is what Jesse Redmond Fawcett wanted to put into the reader's mind of just how self-hating and racist Olivia Blanchard Cary was. Okay? The fifth and final instance is where we end this act. And if you haven't read, spoiler alert, Oliver's end is not going to be good, okay? He's going to feel betrayed. So Chris Sr. asked his son while he's away on a trip. Maybe it was Chris Jr. I think it was his father. I haven't been able to go back and read. For his son to take a few suits to the dry cleaners, which Oliver obliged. After having a sandwich, of course, or before he had his sandwich, he went in and checked the pockets as his either brother or father asked him to. And he finds a letter. A letter that his own mother had written to the father, Chris Sr. And in the both instances where I'm going to read you excerpts, that's all there were to the letters, excerpts. This is what her son read that upset him, because Oliver decided to read the letter because he saw the phrase, "if it just weren't for Oliver," and it gnawed at him. So instead of finishing his lunch, he is confronted with the following excerpt. "It is too heavenly for words, Christopher," referring to Paris and to all of France. "I wish you could see it too. The little towns, the little towns are like jewels, each one lovelier than the other. Yes, I know you're surprised to hear me talk like that, but that's what these places do to you. Even their names, please. Villefranche, Beaulieu, Cagny, Monte Carlo, One Les Pen. I like One Les Pen best. And they say property is marvelously cheap. I'd be willing to live there the rest of my life. And I bet you would too. There's a nice colony resident the whole year round. If you and Chris would come and settle down over here, we could all be as white as we look. If it just weren't for Oliver. I know you don't like me to talk about this, but really, Chris, Oliver and his unfortunate color has certainly been a millstone around our necks all of our lives. And now that Teresa is going to marry her Frenchman, it would be easy enough for us to establish a pied-à-terre here. You see, my French is coming along too, and it tags off. At the time, Teresa was not yet married to the Frenchman. From the way this letter reads, this is the first instance in which Oliver finally figures out why his mother does not love him. His skin color and him coming out bronze brown like Lee Blanchard was never going to allow them to have a relationship. Now, there was a part of the novel in the beginning in which Teresa, at the time, who thought she was going to marry Henry, I forgot to mention that previously, promised that one day she was going to marry Henry and then come back for Oliver to take him out of the house because she just didn't trust her mother. Oliver, still looking on that promise now that she married this Frenchman, writes his sister a letter. And what she has to say will seal Oliver's fate. The following is the excerpt. Darling, I'm so sorry I can't do what you want. It is a little early to be talking in this way, so soon, and I don't want you to tell Father, but I'm afraid my marriage is going to be different from what I had expected. Perhaps no marriage is what one thinks it is going to be, but you can't understand that yet. The funny thing is, Oliver, that even before I received your letter, I'd begun to cast about for ways and means of bringing you over here. We could have enjoyed life here so much together, but the one thing that I never meant to come between you and me prevents it. I have been so foolish. I might have foreseen it. Oliver, my husband doesn't know I'm colored. Perhaps I might have got around that. But just the other day he talked to me very bitterly about people of mixed blood, especially Americans. So, darling, you see with your telltale color, and it trails off. This is the final rejection from Oliver. He had known his mother didn't love him. He just didn't know that his own sister, who showed him a motherly affection, would reject him. He takes a gun, holds it to his head, and unalives himself. So that ended the Blumenbachish part of the book. So let's talk about the last parts that we're going to go through briefly, okay? Phoebe Grant is the fifth plot. She grows up and starts working in a store where a white guy named Llewellyn Nash comes to visit in. He doesn't know that she is black. Then, of course, outside of work, after working in a high fancy inn white store by day, because she can pass for white, afterwards she hangs with a childhood friend, Nicholas, who always felt like he had to compete with Chris Cary. He's even seen complaining about Chris Cary, despite the fact that he fails to understand that Chris sees himself as black. He doesn't play his mother's game all of the time. And in any case, Chris Jr. is at home and finds himself, after getting kicked out of school, of course you'd have to read the novel, go back and read that, so I'm not going to tell y'all everything, falls in love with Maurice. But that ideal is shut down when Olivia confronts the woman due to her light skin. And of course you see what Maurice said. She put up an act in front of Olivia, but deep down felt dejected that she was talked down to that way. So though Maurice also could see herself with Chris Jr., not because of his skin, but because of other attributes, she did not want to fight or ever have to sit and compete with his mother. This is when Chris is reintroduced to Phoebe, who feels dejected because Nicholas would not propose. And then even Nicholas gives some guilt trips about skin color and race. While entertaining Chris Cary, she's also starting to see the white guy, Llewellyn Nash, from the store. And then he says something so racist, she's turned off and says, look, I'm black. At first he doesn't believe her and says, you shouldn't denigrate yourself like that. She says, no, I really am black. If you saw my mother, you would know. Because her father, the book doesn't say why he went off and started another family, presumably white, because he's white. So either her mother had an affair with him or there was a fling. I don't think that Comedy American style seemed fully clear on that. But based on another novel from Jesse Redmond Fawcett, The China Berry Tree, you can kind of see those parallels where they go across the track, have the half black kids, and then act like they don't exist when they have their full white families. Phoebe would marry Chris and they would run into issues with Olivia. I mean, who doesn't? But the difference between Teresa versus Chris, because Chris resisted the urge to live as a white person and resisted her in time. The Great Depression's rolling around now. He sticks with Phoebe, and in the end, they get their happy ending. Of course, at this time, by the time we get to Phoebe's act, Chris Sr. had gotten real sick over the loss of Oliver, and he wouldn't recover to the very end of the book. Now we'll go to the final slide. I'll let you all sit here and go through it. Olivia, having indifference to the fact that Oliver took his life, because of course she didn't show emotion. She didn't want a black looking child, or any child that could not pass for white. The fact that her husband was sick, she was indifferent to that because she was never in love with him. And the fact that her son married a woman who could easily pass for white, which she always wanted, but didn't act the way she wanted. And he's a doctor. She got tired of all of them and went back to the one child that she thought she could control, Teresa. The racist husband, who still don't know that they are black, kicks her off their property. She begs her husband to send money. It's the Great Depression. Now she's stuck in Paris having to continue to downgrade her rooms because the act that she has to put up of having white affluence fell apart during the Great Depression. The Curtains was a telltale. You get the sense that Olivia was starting to feel some remorse for how she acted, but she hadn't fully changed. Jessie Redmond Fawcett, of all of her 4 novels, this was the 4th and final one. Went hardcore on Olivia Blanchard Cary. Now, why did she take it to the level that she did? If you all have time and can go to the Library of Congress and look up old news articles and you type in Jessie Redmond Fawcett and the stories that she either participated in or the reviews of her books, you'll see this pervasiveness of Blumenbach racial categories and the obsession with passing to have a better economic opportunity. I think based on how she moved in certain social structures, because she worked for the Crisis paper, which is printed, I think, to this day by the NAACP, and the fact that she herself comes from a known family from Philadelphia, because a lot of the what we call black elite, a lot that don't have a huge legacy of slavery like most FBA and ADOS people, had money. So she grew up with a different affluence. I think she understood the fakeness of it, and she could articulate that in this novel. This is bold. I just gave you the Blumenbachish version. What I told you were little nuggets, but it's nothing compared to how bold this character actually is. Based on her research on racial issues, based on her personal experiences, and based on all 4 of her novels, we can deduce that she got these characters from a little bit of the hatred in society, as well as how she moved in social circles, what these black women may have said in private. I want to thank you all for watching this series. I'm filled with gratitude because we're coming at the end of this month and of this entire series, and I have nothing but gratitude for all of you who have watched it all, because November 30th will be my last full day getting online every day until like February. So I am filled with gratitude that you all watched. I encourage you to go read Comedy American Style if you're a person that can stomach this type of self-hatred. But the point about it is that you see this, and you can see there's no huge parallels between herself and Madame Butterfly. It's simply that literature conveys a story of self-hatred, and that something that is fiction can still translate to real life. Thank y'all for watching. Feel free to leave comments. Thanks again.